You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the Dark Feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia. I'm your host, Breege Burke. For this week's episode, rather than talk about a particular mythological figure, we're going to talk a little bit about a kind of a group of mythological narratives that Sarah Iles-Johnston refers to as the Dying Maidens or the Hanging Virgins. In particular, Hanging Virgins really being sort of a subset of this Dying Maiden, I don't know what you want to call it, theme. We'll call it a theme. And the question becomes, with a theme like this, the stories, if you read the stories, they seem rather strange. And we've talked recently about the Furies, we've talked about, or the Erinyes, we've talked about, we've talked about different, I'm trying to find the right word here, where we've talked about these sort of different goddesses who deal with women particularly who are on the verge. They're kind of in between girlhood and adulthood. We talked about Persephone last time in particular. We talked about how her myth actually, there may be, at least on one level, a representation of that passage from girlhood to womanhood. Okay. And although it's also important to understand that in ancient Greece, that to become a full Gine, to become a full woman, and not just, Parthenos or Kore, one actually had to give her husband children in order to actually fully reach that state. Otherwise, if she was still kind of considered Parthenos or virgin until that time, even if she was married. And this sort of rite of passage, it's very interesting the connection that this has to the chthonic realm, to the underworld. There's a few focal points here. As I was researching this, and my main source for this I'm going to cite right now, which is one I've used before, which is The Restless Dead by Sarah Iles-Johnston. And I've actually been looking elsewhere outside of her work for a little bit more information about these stories, but it's other than the finding certain accounts of the stories themselves, it's been very difficult to find something else that's quite specific on this theme. So I'm relying a little bit heavily on her version. So just so you know, if you want to do further research, I recommend checking the book out. The full title is The Restless Dead: Encounters Between the Living and Dead in Ancient Greece, and it's not a subject that's very well written on. But this time, I think with talking about the Hanging Virgins, and the reason I bring these up now is because, simply because we are talking about these rites of passage. Like I said, we've talked about the Furies and the idea of young women who end up accompanying the Furies. We talk about, young women who are snatched away before they are able to bear children. You have different stories, or that snatch away, the children themselves. And this is sort of this is in keeping with that kind of a theme. The Hanging Virgins is very interesting because I could probably point to at least two or three major themes that these stories seem to center around in all of their different versions. Because again, like most myths and mythological stories, there is there's multiple versions, and outcomes may be different in different stories. Okay, so just looking at my notes here. Okay, so let's talk about what the Hanging Virgins are. As I mentioned, they're sort of part of the Dying Maiden motif. And generally, the stories about them tend to fall into one of two categories. One, you have a young girl who angers a goddess in some way and is therefore, either killed or driven to suicide or something like that. And in another case, it may be a young girl who is threatened by someone outside of her family. It could be someone who's threatening to rape her, for example. Or, there's a couple of different examples of these kinds of stories. In some of these stories, they'll bring in a young man, as I think I had mentioned, the quote-unquote bad boy motif. In some cases, we are going to bring in, there are young men who, where basically, where the young girl falls in love with with this person, and then the union is forbidden by parents, or that the person abandons her. And so, of course, she kills herself in grief. That's another sort of offshoot of this. Although Iles-Johnston, when she talks about those stories, usually Dionysus tends to be the figure, the seducing figure. And he does, and she's sort of wary of his actual role in these. She thinks it might, that the representations might actually be something different. But worth mentioning that is sometimes part of the story. Now, what all the stories have to do with is some kind of inappropriate behavior on the part of young girls, usually sexual in nature. So it could be appealing to a goddess who is in their married form. It's interesting. There are different versions of Hera and Artemis and Athena and the various Olympian goddesses, and some of them you are only allowed to make offerings to if you have reached a certain stage of life. And if the girls are making offerings to a version of Hera who is meant for married women, who is, it's intended, it's married women who are supposed to refer to her by that name and make offerings under that name, then they could be punished if they are not, in fact, married women. Okay, that's one kind of that's one considered inappropriate behavior having to do with sex in a different way. But it may also simply be, being, falling in love outside of perhaps what their parents' wishes are, or actually engaging in sexual, behavior that is forbidden or is problematic for the goddesses. So, in other words, in a way, and now one might want to take a moralistic view of this and say, oh, well, if you're maybe it's a way of, like a didactic tale. It's more moralistic, where you're saying, oh, well, young girls who engage in this inappropriate behavior, it's a warning not to do that, because look what could happen to you. Maybe you never will get married. Maybe you'll die a virgin and have to, follow these particular deities around the underworld. The deities in particular that are associated with these dying maidens and the hanging virgins tend to be within the underworld. We're talking about Hecate, and we're talking about the Furies or the Erinyes in particular. As far as the Olympians go, as we'll see, the main goddess who seems to be associated with them is Artemis. Okay, and Artemis, I would like to do a whole episode on Artemis, even though she's not technically chthonic, because she has so much to do with the rites of passage. She has a connection to Hecate. And Hecate, of course, is going to be the subject of the next episode. But, there's just so much there that really plays into this theme. And as we know, Artemis is a virgin goddess. So, the virginity of young girls and the appropriateness of their passage into womanhood and motherhood and that sort of thing seems to be of great concern. And, and this is not a view, it's a view we sort of get away from in the 21st century, but it's not one that's entirely gone away. As I've said in previous episodes, there's still a valuing of female chastity and virginity and things like that in teenage girls in particular. But although I don't think we're quite as... Again, depending on, what kind of community you belong to, I don't think people are quite as stringent about this as they might have been in earlier times, where that was a woman's role. She was expected to get married and to have children, and that was, and to not do that was just somehow some kind of abomination. Medea, who another figure who we'll need to talk about, the sorceress Medea, who is a niece of Circe or Circe, depending on how you say it. And she was the one who was seduced by Jason in the story of the Argonautica. And Medea is sort of an archetype of the female who is the inappropriate female who basically violates all stereotypes. And she's an interesting one because Medea is also someone who, when she does actually accede, I suppose you could say, to what the traditional order is, that, when she does take a husband, when she does have children with him, when she does submit to Jason to be his wife. And she does all kinds of things for Jason. She murders her own brother. And then they have to be, they're being, chased out of town, and they have to be purified and everything else. And, and then Jason decides he finds a better match over in, near Corinth, and says, it was nice knowing you, and the 2 kids, see ya, Don't be selfish. I need to make a good day myself. And Medea responds basically by killing the 2 children and setting his new bride on fire and her father, and then taking off on the chariot of the sun. That's how she rolls. She's not, and again, depending on which version you read about this of that story in Greek drama and in other places, it depends on whether or not you have sympathy for Medea. I have a lot of sympathy for her, but I'll save that for another episode. Okay, so let's talk about the stories themselves. So let's say an example of someone who is, trying to give some examples of these sort of hanging virgin stories, or these dying maidens who have angered a goddess in some way. One of the first ones that is mentioned by Sarah Iles-Johnston is Callisto. Now, Callisto was a priestess of the goddess Artemis, and she ends up being seduced by Zeus. Now, Zeus actually appears to her in the form of Artemis, so Artemis calls to her, and she says, "Come here," and so Callisto, of course, dutifully obeys and goes to her goddess mistress. And then, of course, it turns out it's Zeus, and he grabs a hold of her and rapes her, which Artemis does not take kindly to. But, of course, as always, Zeus is not the one who is blamed. Callisto was actually turned into a bear and ends up being hunted by the child that she gives birth to, because this is how Artemis figures out that she's pregnant. And then when she becomes pregnant, figures out what's happened. And eventually what happens is both, her son is also turned into a bear, and they're both made into constellations in the sky. But Callisto and Arcas. So, there's an example of a girl who, this is not a hanging virgin story, but that's an example of, a virgin girl who manages to anger a goddess through an inappropriate encounter, even though she did not initiate that encounter, considered to be an inappropriate encounter, and she's therefore punished for it, and ends up, in some senses being killed, another maybe being made a constellation, maybe that's not assuming that she's going to be killed. But that was the gods taking pity at the last minute and saying, no, let's do this. Okay. Some other ones, the story of Ariadne is another one. Now that one's a little complicated because Ariadne, there's several different versions of this story. Ariadne is connected with the story of Theseus. Theseus is the one who goes into the maze and slays the Minotaur, okay? That was the story about the tribute that had to go from Athens to Crete, because King Minos, somebody, they had the games there, and somebody from Athens slew one of the one of the other players, and so the king of course Athens wanted to make amends, and he says, well, if one Athenian's guilty, they're all guilty, so he would send a tribute to be fed to the Minotaur. The Minotaur's origins are interesting, but I don't want to get too sidetracked with that. In any case, Ariadne falls in love with Theseus, and she gives him, when he has to go into the maze, where usually, they're eaten by the Minotaur and they die. They're not supposed to bring weapons in, but she helps him sneak in a sword. And she gives him a ball of thread so that he can, and she tells him how to go, basically keep going straight and then down, which is interesting. But he keeps, and he can unwind the ball of thread as he goes so he can find his way back. So he, of course, successfully gets in and out of the maze, slays the Minotaur, saves the rest of the Athenians from being eaten, and then Ariadne wants to marry him, and he intends to marry her, but they're waiting on the shore to get on the ship, but then I believe it's Athena who appears to him and then says, no, you have to go on and leave her behind. Now, supposedly, in her despair, in some versions, in her despair, she kills herself. In other versions, she gets married to Dionysus, who comes to console her by, becoming her husband. In any case, that's another one of these stories where you have a young girl, and it is inappropriate in a sense because she's going against her father. The father figure actually plays a big role in this, because the father is, it's kind of like, okay, if we think about weddings today where the father of the bride, walks the bride down the aisle, there's still that tradition of, quote unquote, giving away the bride, which is, I don't know, it's funny when we just do these things automatically as part, this is what I mean, is part of ritual, as part of tradition. When you kind of start to think about it, you kind of go, why is somebody giving me away? But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked on that. In any case, sometimes these are cases of where the father has died, and that also sends the daughter into grief because now she does not have her father to properly guide her as a rite of passage to her next phase, because that is part of the deal. Now, one story like this is the story of Erigone, okay? Now, Erigone, let me start by telling you giving you sort of a general overview of who she's supposed to be. In Greek myth, she's the daughter of Icarus of Athens. Okay, I'm sorry, not Icarus, Icarius. I'm thinking of the other guy, the one who flows out into the sun. Icarius of Athens. And Icarius is the one who's kind of known for bringing wine to Athens. He's friendly with Dionysus. He gets the wine, and he gives it to the shepherds. And because they have never experienced intoxication before, they think they're being poisoned, so they kill him. And it says, and this is just the sort of little Wikipedia summary, but they say his daughter Erigone and her dog Mira found his body. Erigone hanged herself over her father's grave. Dionysus was angry and punished Athens by making all the city's maidens commit suicide in the same way. Okay, Erigone was placed in the stars as the constellation Virgo. Okay, so and again, here we see Dionysus involved again, though not in a sexual way. It's more that he gives a gift, and the gift is Dionysus has his own set of stories where his gifts are rejected, or his divinity is rejected, and there's always very dire consequences. But the important piece that you want to think about here is not only that she hangs herself as a virgin, so she never does make it into womanhood, but the fact that now there's like a curse. So she has hung herself, and now all these other women after her will also hang themselves. Okay, and there's an interesting tradition in here. I'm going to read a little bit from Iles-Johnston here on this story. So, in what she says here, there are two variations of Erigone's myth, in each which we can discern contamination by other myths and rituals. The one that is better known tells of how Dionysus came to Athens during the time of King Icarius, who is said to be Erigone's father. Having received the gift of wine from Dionysus, Icarus shared it with his neighbors. We know this part. So that's the version we just read. The other version of Erigone's myth makes her the daughter of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. Aegisthus being the half-brother of Agamemnon, who pursues Orestes to Athens, seeking vengeance for their murders. At this point, the story splits into two endings. Either Erigone hangs herself in grief when Orestes is acquitted on the Areopagus, or she is threatened by Orestes, who has already killed her brother Aletes. In the second variation, Artemis intervenes at the last minute, whisking Erigone away to become a priestess in her Athenian temple. Now, what's interesting about the second version is that that's also very, very similar in some ways to the story of Iphigenia, who Agamemnon... actually, this is the whole reason Clytemnestra is really angry with Agamemnon, is that Iphigenia is taken to be sacrificed for favorable winds. And by the way, similar to Chthonia herself, another daughter of Athenian king who being sacrificed for favorable outcome in war. And in that case as well, at least in one version of that story, Artemis comes and whisks her away either to be a temple priestess or to become the goddess Hecate, a point we will get to later on. Okay. So Iles-Johnston kind of goes on to say why she's kind of suspicious of the Dionysus version. The way she says it is, the first version of Erigone's story has been contaminated by Dionysiac concerns, except perhaps in a late version that makes Dionysus seduce Erigone, there is no further connection between the girl and the god of wine. We might guess that because the rites associated with Erigone's myth were practiced at the same time of year as the, I'm never going to say this right, Anthesteria, okay, I did say it right. This festival incorporated so many other diverse elements, incorporated her rites too, and thereby pulled Erigone into Dionysus' orbit. So, in other words, the festival that has to do with Erigone, and it's an interesting one, and when I tell you about it, is that because it takes place around the same time as Dionysus' festival, therefore they kind of try to find a way to fit Dionysus into the story. This is Sarah Iles-Johnston. So the second version, this is again, I'm quoting again from this. From Restless Dead. The second version of Erigone's story serves to bring her into connection with the epic cycle, and specifically with the popular Mycenaean saga. The plot may have been suggested by the fact that Orestes' flight from Mycenae was associated with the Anthesteria. The first day of the festival included a special rite that commemorated his arrival in Athens after the murders. But whatever the exact apparatus was that brought Erigone into association with the house of Atreus, the point was to associate a local Athenian heroine with an important pan-Hellenically famous myth. Now, of course, that myth, if you don't know what they mean by that, that has to do with the Trojan War, and it has to do with the house of Atreus. And again, Agamemnon, who is king of Mycenae, he is one of the chief generals of the Trojan War, and this is the cycle that I'm talking about where he sacrifices his daughter for favorable winds, and then There's actually, the House of Atreus actually has a huge amount of intrigue. It's not the subject of this podcast, which is why I'm not going to get into that. But House of Atreus might be something that's worth looking up. If people are interested in me doing a special, discussion or class or genealogy of that particular aspect of Greek myth, I'm happy to do so, but it would have to be a separate thing. So, so there's the death. Then Clytemnestra plots to kill Agamemnon because, and she plots with his half-brother Aegistheus, who's a product of incest, but we won't get into that. And then, of course, they kill him, and then Orestes has to come. And that's what we were talking about when we talked about the Erinyes episode, the story of Orestes. So we talked about the Oresteia there, and that's the very famous epic that she's referring to here. Okay. So just to go on what she's saying, Sarah Iles-Johnston is saying, underneath the accretions of each version lies the simple tale of a maiden whose life was cut off before she could marry. The fact is, in both versions of her tragedy, that in both versions, her tragedy is precipitated by the death of her father, the man who would have arranged her marriage, and in one version by subsequent death of her brother as well, the man who would have arranged her marriage in her father's absence. Makes this point clearer. She is alone without anyone to guarantee her proper passage from maiden to wife. So that's to the point I made earlier. It is also significant that she dies by hanging herself, for as noted already, this is a means of death particularly associated with the deaths of virgins, and even more so with the deaths of virgins connected to Artemis. Okay. As Helen King has shown in detail, this bloodless death emblematizes the fact that they have not and never will bleed, as women are properly bound to bleed on their wedding nights or in the course of childbirth, or, and I'm going to add, when one menstruates. Okay? As we shall see below, the hanging oneself on a tree, as opposed to anything else, is also typical for girls connected to Artemis, and may reflect this goddess's connection with trees in cult. Of course, this alternative ending to the story, in which Erigone becomes a priestess of Artemis, follows another theme commonly found in maidens' tragedies. Okay, it indicates the myth was an Aegeon for some Attic cults of Artemis. Okay, now as far as the curse goes, okay, and now in some versions, like I mentioned, the one I just mentioned to you, Dionysus curses the Athenians. In another version, Erigone herself curses them. And she condemns all their daughters to swing just as she was swinging from the tree. Athenian virgins then began to kill themselves in droves to stop the suicides, and at the advice of Delphi, the oracle of Apollo, the Athenians then instituted the rite of the Aora, swinging, in which the girls fulfilled the letter, if not the spirit, of Erigone's curse by swinging on chairs suspended from trees by ropes in much of the same manner as children now swing. Indeed, in vase paintings of the scene, the activity sometimes looks rather playful. The Aora was celebrated on the third and final day of the Anthesteria. Now that's important right there. Okay, so as part of the sort of coming of age ritual for young girls, they would get on these swings and they would participate in the Aora as a means of thwarting any kind of premature death before they could fulfill their, what we'll call their womanly role. Okay, now this one is interesting as well. I have some notes on this elsewhere. Let me just find my, here we go. I'm just kind of jumping around. I made notes. I always make notes for my podcast in advance, but this is a subject where so many things are so interwoven. I'm trying to make sure that I keep all of the appropriate things together. Okay. So the first thing is, so let's talk about this song called the Aletis, or the Wanderer. And again, I'll quote from Iles-Johnston here. It was also performed by Athenian girls on the third day of the Anthesteria. Our sources say that it commemorated the wandering of Erigone, whom they say took on the name Aletis, as she searched for her missing father. Okay, so we have this theme of wandering. We might guess that the name of her brother in the second version of myth, Aletes, alternatively explained the institution of the song. Okay, the name of the song implies a further significance, for it echoes the theme found in many myths about girls undergoing transition. Often the event that interrupts the transition also compels them to leave their homes and wander abroad in the countryside or in foreign lands. For example, Ariadne goes to Crete, Io travels the ancient world, the Protides, where another group of girls who die of a young age run in the fields. This is appropriate, for the transition represents a time of life when the individual is neither fully girl nor fully woman. She is not at home in neither camp. Okay, so she's in a liminal space. She's in between. Even when not connected with transitional myths, wandering is associated with characters who are exiled from normal life and normal roles. Odysseus is a prime example of this. Indeed, the Etymologicum Magnum tells us that Aletus was not only the name of an Athenian song and a nickname for its heroine, but also a nickname of that most abnormal of all mythic characters, Medea, woman who spent her life wandering in exile from one city-state to another precisely because she rejected the proper female roles of dutiful daughter, submissive wife, and nurturing mother. Okay, and here's another point. Dangerous ghosts, too, are paradigmatic wanderers, in part because they are excluded from resting in the underworld. Okay? So the theme of wandering is here, too. So we've got the theme of hanging and the theme of wandering. These two rites end up being connected. Probably there's some relationship to the rites of Artemis Broron, in which the girls also run around, as they say, acting like bears. But I'll save that for the Artemis episode. So the idea is that this is to preclude any real disaster from happening to the girls. And so, in my notes, I'm saying, okay, when we talk about wandering, it's not only the search for a missing loved one. We can look at the myth of Demeter and Persephone that way, too. Her mother is sort of a wanderer as well, searching for her daughter, although the search does come to an end. It can refer to leaving home, okay, like presumably when one becomes married, now their husband might take them far away, okay, representing the rejection of traditional roles. So therefore you wander, you're not tethered down to a particular domestic or familial lifestyle. And again, mirrors the behavior of ghosts in the underworld who are not admitted. They're not, they kind of have to, they have to kind of hang around on the edge so in a way they're neither in the world of the dead or the living. And I think that's where the threat is considered to be here, because the idea is to be in the underworld is fine, then you're in the underworld. If you're stuck in that in-between place, that's just not a very good place to be. Okay, so let me just look at some of my other things here. And she makes another point that I didn't quote before, but I have it quoted in my notes, Sarah Iles-Johnston again. She says, the meaning of the death of the mythic virgin, she says, there's a reason to think that they, like the goddesses with whom they were connected, could cause trouble for real girls of the polis of the city-state, if not effectively dealt with, okay? So there's this idea that, the idea, you're certainly getting the impression here that the transition from girlhood to womanhood is a rather dangerous time. There's a tremendous amount of mythology surrounding this, okay? Let me give you one other story here of Carya, okay? And again, I'm going to have to read it. I do have, I can give you a brief explanation of who she is. She's from Laconia, and she is the daughter of the Laconian king Dion and his wife Amphithea, King Dion and Amphithea, daughter of Pronax. Okay. Her sisters were Lyco and Orphe. Apollo, in reward for Dion and Amphithea receiving him with great reverence and hospitality, bestowed a gift of prophecy upon their daughters, but imposed a restriction that they should not betray gods nor search after forbidden lore. No practicing witchcraft there, girls. Okay. So later, Dionysus, gosh darn it if he doesn't show up again, also paid a visit to Dion's house and was received with equal hospitality. During his stay, he fell in love with Carya and lay with her secretly. He then left, but, missing Carya, soon returned under the pretext of consecrating a temple in which Dion had built for him. But Lyco and Orphe, suspecting a love affair between Dionysus and their sister, guarded Carya to prevent her from having intercourse with the god. By doing so, they committed a violation of the restrictions imposed by Apollo. So Dionysus, after several warnings and threats, drove the two sisters mad, in which state they ran off to Mount Taygetus, where they were transformed into rocks. Carya was changed by Dionysus into a walnut tree. Okay. And from these circumstances, later arose the cult of Artemis Caryatids. Okay. Now, very interesting story, because in this story also, which is not mentioned in this particular summary, is that there were also a rash of virgins hanging themselves from the nut tree, so Carya herself isn't hung, but it's like a cursed tree from which many virgins decide to hang themselves. Okay, so again, interesting example of kind of mass hysteria, would that be? Let's see. Sarah Iles-Johnston uses the term prostropeos, okay, which is a term she uses for Erigone and also for Carya, and it's the idea of a girl who, it's like, there has to be tribute. Now, once the girl dies, it's like there's a curse left behind and tribute must be paid. Okay, you have to be propitiated. Okay, that's, or there needs to be prostrations or offerings before that. Let's see. Let me just find. I just want to find the actual. There's a lot of preliminary stuff here about going back to Erigone, but I want to get to where she is. Okay. Yeah, let us return now to myth and ritual complexes by means of the story of Carya. In the fullest version of the myth, Carya is a Laconian girl seduced by Dionysus, subsequently turned by him into a nut tree when her sisters prevented her from accepting his further advances. Richard Seaford has suggested the myth expresses the divided loyalties of the transitional girl. She is torn between her natal family and the stranger, Dionysus, who comes from outside to marry her. Okay, remember what I said about the bad boy? When handled incorrectly, the myth seems to say the transfer of loyalty from natal to marital family ends in tragedy. Seaford is surely correct, but we must wonder whether in other cases, including that of Erigone, by the way, I'm quoting Iles-Johnston again, just want to make it clear I'm quoting, Dionysiac concerns have been grafted onto another myth. Caryatis was Artemis's cult title at a famous Laconian temple in the village of Carya near Caphi. The priestesses there were called Caryatidae, and each year Laconian girls performed a dance called the Caryatis at a festival in honor of Artemis called the Caryatia. Boy, how many different ways can we say that? These pieces of information, combined with the basic plot of the myth, an unmarried girl becomes involved in an illicit sexual relationship and subsequently suffers, indicate that the myth of Carya originally was associated with Artemis and with a dance performed by girls in the festivals in that goddess's honor. Judging from Artemis's epiclesias and the name of her local festivity in Preciuses, the Carua tree must have been sacred to her in Laconia, the nut tree, that is. Thus, Carya's transformation would signify the same thing as being transformed into a cult statue. As in the case of Erigone's myth, Dionysus seems remarkably dispensable, thrust into the role of seducer that almost any male could have played. It is probable that in the original myth it was Artemis, not Dionysus, who turned Carya into the nut tree, either to punish the girl for having been seduced or perhaps to rescue her from threatened rape. Okay, that's the other thing. Either would bring the story into alignment with the paradigm discussed at the beginning of that section. Okay. Honorable though this transformation may have been, it prevents Carya from completing her transition from virgin to mother, and thus leaves her permanently stranded in the same liminal state as Erigone. And that's the, that is the part of the problem there. So again, there's this idea of the difficulty of liminality. Okay, just a quick mention of a couple of other examples of virgins who die before their time. The Pandariids are mentioned in the Odyssey by Penelope, and what their tragic story seems to be that they are, they're also in a case where they are supposed to be married. Things go wrong. And again, to quote Iles-Johnston here, at first it seems disaster will nonetheless be averted and the girls will live out normal lives, for they are adopted by 4 goddesses who are especially adept at preparing girls to become wives and mothers. Aphrodite feeds them, Hera gives them exceptional beauty and wisdom, Artemis gives them stature, and Athena teaches them handiwork. Just as Aphrodite is arranging their marriages, another disaster strikes. The Harpies snatch the girls. Harpies are these these winged bird-like creatures with sort of female heads. Another chthonic set of monsters. I think we see them in the Argonautica in particular. They snatch the girls and hand them over to the Erinyes, whom they will be compelled to accompany forevermore. So remember when I talked about the Erinyes in that episode, that I talked about girls who die before their time. In this case, I believe there was probably a loss of the parents again, and then so they're like I said, they're adopted by these goddesses, but then they are still snatched away to the underworld before they have a chance to become, quote unquote, full women here. Now, of course, as she notes, we don't actually know why this happened. So we don't know if something wrong was done wrong. We don't know exactly why this occurred. Okay. And also, we don't know what it's meant. And she also, as Sarah Iles-Johnston points out, she also fails to explain what does it mean to accompany the Erinyes. Now, the guess that Iles-Johnston makes, the Erinyes were well known as spirits of the underworld who caused problems for the living. In literature, their attacks look justified. They punish those who transgress the rules of civilized behavior. Okay. So there may be, so one might guess that in some way that some kind of rule was violated in spite of the fact that these goddesses stepped in. Let's see. And then Helen, actually. And we're talking about the same Helen who was associated with the Trojan War, the face that launched 1,000 ships from I believe that was Goethe, who says that they had, in this particular one, Helen is, let me just find the story here because I do have it. Yes. After the death of Menelaus, Helen was driven out of Laconia and arrived in Rhodes, hoping to find a home with her friend Polyxo, the widow of Tlepolemus. Polyxo, however, blaming Helen for her husband's death at Troy, secretly plotted revenge. One day she disguised her serving women as Erinyes and sent them to attack Helen, who was bathing. The women seized Helen and hanged her from a nearby tree. Okay. It is for this reason, Pausanias concludes, that Rhodians now have a temple of Helen Dendritis, Helen of the tree. Okay. And so again, we have somebody hanging from a tree, women in particular hanging from a tree. Okay, and that's kind of an alternate thing. It's also interesting to note that the main goddess associated with these events is Artemis. Okay, I'm looking at a little chart that she has here. If anybody owns this book, it's on page 248, but she has a little table, Dying Maidens in Greek Myth. And in most cases, always a failed transition. You know, most of them are hanged, except for the Pandariids and Iphigenia, who was sacrificed. In some cases, they become a priestess. In other cases, they're turned into a nut tree or into a statue. And in all of these cases, and some of them are associated with certain rites to protect young girls from doing that, suffering such a fate where they would be left in such a liminal state. And in other cases, too, like with Iphigenia, which a story that I actually want to save. She's not a hanging virgin, for one thing, so that doesn't really apply here. But the sacrifice of Iphigenia, her being saved by Artemis, and like again, in Hesiod's catalog of women, and then in another, there's another source too, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but they both say that she's spirited away and becomes the goddess Hecate. Okay, so Hecate also tends to be connected with these kinds of myths. I want to get more into that in the Hecate episode, because there's a little bit more there that has to do with the relationship between Artemis and Hecate. But again, and I've always said that Hecate is sort of the underworld Artemis. I do think the two are very intimately connected. But Artemis herself, even though she's technically a virgin huntress, that's her main role, she's very liminal herself. She's got a foot in both worlds. She's a female goddess, but she's sort of associated with something we tend to associate with men, which is hunting. Okay. And I think ultimately then we have to look at the question here. Why is this such a huge mythological subject? Why is the idea of what is the danger of passing from girlhood to womanhood? I mean, is it simply, well, maybe I shouldn't say simply, it's maybe not the right phrase, but is it really just about the fact the pains of menstruation? Is it really just about the dangers of childbirth? I mean, not again, I say it in that tone mainly because I don't want to I don't want to minimize that, because, and especially at that time. Nowadays, it's probably far less dangerous, at least if you have proper hospitalization and so forth. Still not a pleasant experience by any means. Even for women who love their children and love having children. Childbirth is a trauma. So, and it could be just the propensity for either girls to, because of their high hormone level or whatever, to wander off and maybe do something they're not supposed to, or the dangers of just everything associated with female sexuality, which, you wonder if that's really where these myths come from. Is that really the whole essence of them? To me, there seems to be something. I mean, it's something to be thought about. I have to basically leave it as an open question, mainly because, as I've mentioned sort of in my introduction to this whole series of podcasts, for some reason the feminine, that kind of female energy is very, very threatening to society. Seems to be threatening to society, especially when we talk about a patriarchal society. And one of the questions I sort of raise in creating this whole series is why. Why do women have to be kept in a state of virginity? Why do women have to be submission? What's the reason for this? I mean, is it just, is it just that, we're trying to maintain traditional boundaries and grow families? Is it still really about that? Because it's an idea that subconsciously has not gone away in our culture. We still sort of have this idea that somehow there's something so dangerous about that period, and I don't think at this point it's really just something that's about women entering people going into womanhood. Okay, yeah, I think that's part of it. I'm not saying that's not part of it, but there seems to be something to explore there about why this might be, why this creative feminine energy might be considered so dangerous, at least in the Western world. But there's a lot more explanation for things in the Eastern world. But that will be another separate series of podcasts, which I look forward to doing. Actually, I love the Eastern myths. Okay, so with that, I hear people outside my door. So I'm going to finish up, and I'm just going to say thank you again for listening. Please check out my website, Chthonia.net. There's some cool new stuff coming up. I should have classes coming up soon, probably by like mid-October. I think we're going to do an underworld mythology class. I'll be having special workshops on the demonic and the feminine. Those dates will be determined. That'll be a shorter event. And I've got some more, I'm going to be doing some rearranging, and there's some new stuff coming up. I would like to revamp some of the website, too, because it's kind of, it could use some maintenance. But check it out. If you're interested in donating to any of my projects, patreon.com/Chthonia is where my patron site is, and you get special rewards as a patron. You can check those out. And, and of course, this is available on, metapsychosis.com. There's a series. I should have an interview coming out soon with Marco Morelli, introducing that series for metapsychosis readers and listeners. So with that, I want to say thank you very much. Big thank you to my patrons. And I will talk to all of you in the next episode.